And as I explained yesterday, everybody in this society depends on the success of valorizing capital. The capitalist depends on it for profit. If a profit is not made, the capitalist is bankrupt, and the capitalist devalued and liquidated. The laborer depends on the valorization of capital, because the laborer depends on employment and wage income in order to connect him or herself to the means of subsistence. So valorization in that sense is the essence of wealth in this society, upon which the life of every single individual hangs by and depends. And the state is the political form, I will argue now, of that conception, of that dynamic, of that particular historical form of wealth. It's rather hard-pressed to find in Marx at any length something where we can say this is the Marx writing about the state in terms of the political form of society and the capitalist state and what it is and what it does and how it comes about. It's very difficult to find something there. For that very reason, and as Marx himself did, I will look at classical political economy, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, to come to an understanding of what Marx in fact criticized. The critique of political economy is to a great extent the critique of Adam Smith. And Marx's idea of the state, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, that the state is the executive of the modern state, that is only a committee for managing the common affairs of the entire bourgeoisie. That's from the Communist Manifesto. It could be seen as a critical summary of, in fact, Adam Smith's argument about the necessity of the state in capitalist, or what he called in commercial society. So in Adam Smith, I will now argue, you find really clearly expressed the understanding that commercial society, or what we now call bourgeois or capitalist society, requires the independent power of the state. And now I'm going into that. We know, or you will know, that in the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argues with a chapter on what is wealth. And he argues that wealth is the product of the productive expenditure of labor power. And as greater wealth, he says, the greater the productivity of labor. And the greater the productivity of labor, he argues, the greater the division of labor, which he argues in chapter 1 in terms of a technical division of labor. But throughout, as it were, his account, there's also the argument that the greater division of labor creates a greater social division of labor, which in capitalism manifests itself in the division between classes. He has three classes. He has the class of masters, that is, they are the owners of stock, and they derive from their investment of stock a revenue which is profit. They have no labor, they have no land. The land belongs to the landlords, and they put land, as it were, to productive use. And as a consequence, they derive a revenue which is called rent. And there are the workers, which have neither stock, means of life, means of production, no land, they cannot live from the land, they are deprived from it. What they have is their ability to work, they put labor in, as it were, the production process, and derive the revenue wage from it. So the laborer is positively described as the owner of labor, as the contributor of labor to the production process, but negatively that means the laborer cannot live by his own, as it were, means of subsistence, nor by the land that belongs to the landlord, or the means of subsistence that belong to the master. So the laborer is compelled to work, cannot live for long without working for the profit of the master. But returning now to chapter 1. So there is in Smith the dynamic of wealth, labor power, the ever greater division of labor. And we know Adam Smith as the author, supposedly, of the invisible hand, of the free economy. But towards the end of the chapter, he says, all this ever greater wealth, the dynamic of wealth, the ever greater division of labor, the ever increased productivity of labor, All this, he says, depends on not the invisible hand, not the self-interest of the masters. It depends, he says, on good government. Good government, for Smith, is required in order to make this dynamic of wealth, a wealth of ever greater productivity, of an ever greater division of labor. Good government is required to facilitate that, to make it happen, to safeguard it, to push it forward. Good government. Therefore, Adam Smith, if one looks at the definition of political economy, he doesn't define political economy as the science of the invisible hand. He doesn't define political economy as the science of the free economy. He doesn't define political economy as the science of increased labor economy. He doesn't define political economy as the self-interest of the masters, which he endorses in chapter 2. No, he defines political economy as a political science. He defines it as a branch of the science of the statesman and legislator. In other words, as a science of law and lawmaking, and as the science of the statesman as the executor of the rule of law and as the power of social order. Why does he do that? And I invite you to think about chapter 2 of Adam Smith. In chapter 2, he introduces three characters: the brewer, the butcher, and Christ, who is the second one? Brewer, butcher, baker. These three characters. And he says these three characters work only for themselves. They only work for themselves, not by brewing beer or by making bread to feed the masses. No, they're working for themselves to produce bread in order for bread to transform by means of exchange into money. So it's the money song, the ABBA song. No? It's money, money, money. It's a rich man's word. That's there. The second chapter. They don't produce bread to feed the masses. They produce bread to make money from it. And that's their greed, he says. And that's their self-interest, he says. Why is government required? To facilitate that greed. Well, what other ways could the butcher, the baker, and the brewer adopt? What other means could they do to meet their egoistic interests? What else could they do? Well, they could steal, couldn't they? They could rob. They could do that. They could do cutthroat competition, which literally means bloodletting. If you cut the throat, here we go, blood spills out. That's disorder, if blood is being spilled. And government is required, says Adam Smith, in order to prevent bloodshed and disorder. These guys are not meant to compete, are not meant to express their egoistic interests by cutting the throat of their competitor. They are meant to meet their interests by meeting the criteria of wealth, by, in other words, increasing the productivity of the labor in their employment to beat the competitor, not by cutting the throat of the competitor. What else could these people do? Well, they could do a bit of sabotage, couldn't they? Instead of cutthroat competition, you put a bit of rat poison into the dough of your competing baker. People buy the bread and die of rat poisoning. That's not really either a way of facilitating this promotion or this dynamic of wealth, ever greater labor productivity. That's just, again, bloodshed and disorder through industrial sabotage of somebody else's production line. How else could they do it? Well, you could shake the hands with your competitor and say, let's stop competing against each other. It's not good for business, neither yours nor mine. let's set monopoly prices. You're both happy. But what would stall is, of course, the dynamic of ever-increasing wealth, so the ever-increase in the productivity of labor. It would be impeded. It would be restricted. It would be halted. That cannot be the case. So the state is required to move against monopoly pricing. Or I can meet my competitor, and we shake hands, and we say, you have that market, and I have that market. We're not going to intrude on each other's markets. And that hampers competition. That's a protectionism of our sort of market from each other's grasp. Again, that is not what can be done. That hinders and stalls the very dynamic of wealth that he introduced in chapter 1, a dynamic of ever-increasing labor productivity. The state is required to set the framework conditions, to in fact police the market, to ensure that the invisible hand can do its work. The invisible hand cannot do its work when prices are, as it were, agreed and fixed. The invisible hand cannot do its work if my egoism is such that I either cut the throat of my competitor or poison his or her bread. That's not a regulation by the invisible hand. That's regulation through coercion, sabotage, robbing, stealing, and killing. So the state is required to set the framework conditions in which the invisible hand can be expected to do its work in unimpeded, unrestricted, open markets. So the invisible hand, thereby, becomes almost like something for which the state is responsible, not the baker, not the butcher, not the brewer, who might sabotage the workings of the invisible hand to secure their own self-interests. The market regulation by competitive prices, by the free price mechanism, is something for which good government is required. So far, okay? Can you see where I'm coming from? So for Smith then, and I quote, justice is the main pillar that holds up the whole edifice in commercial society. And justice is not only a matter of law and the rule of law, which is the regulative, as it were, force of the freedom of contract between ostensibly equal exchange subjects. Fundamentally, justice is a matter, quoting from Smith again, of a well-ordered commonwealth. So justice and law is a matter of order. Order is the precondition of law. Or as Carl Schmitt put it, the rule of law does not apply to disorder. Or as far as Adam Smith is concerned, it does not apply to disorder and bloodshed. Disorder and bloodshed is a quotation from Smith. And the law does not enforce order. Order is enforced by the police. Police is responsible for the establishment and for the preservation of order. And police is therefore the premise of the rule of law. Police enforces order, and in this manner renders the rule of law effective. So we always, in English at least, we say, oh, it's law and order. But that's the wrong way around. It's order first, and then law. Law doesn't create order. Order is the premise of law. And the power, the force of order, is not the baker, or the butcher, or the brewer, or any one of us. The force of order is the independent power of the state. Further, Smith argues that the system of justice is dependent upon a moral code, on a certain ethics, on a certain morality that commits individuals to the rules of justice and therewith to the laws of private property. And according to Smith, the law of private property is the law of wealth. And the law of wealth is the law of ever-increasing labor productivity as the one thing that produces wealth, and that produces wealth that, he says, will benefit also those who do the work through the liberal trickle-down effect of wealth, which provides the laborers, the workers, with a liberal reward. So the state is required for the protection of property, for the defense also of the country, of course, for the rule of law, and for the enforcement of the rule of law, for the tranquility of order, and it is required for the facilitation of the invisible hand, and therewith for the facilitation of the rule of wealth, a rule that is based on the ever-increasing productivity of labor, not robbery, not theft, not sabotage, not cutthroat, but the facilitation of wealth through ever-increasing labor productivity. Furthermore, according to Adam Smith, the state is required to do for the economy what the economy cannot do for itself for lack of profit. Infrastructure, for example. Further, the state is required to contain, he argues, the working class, the laborers. Quote, in a word, the affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are often driven by want and promoted by envy to invade his possessions. Leave aside envy. Focus on driven by want. In other words, driven by lack of food, driven by circumstances that disallow them to satisfy their needs. They are driven by want, he says, and thereby might invade the possessions of those with wealth. The protection of private property requires that the indignation and the desperation of the poor is contained on the basis of the freedom of private property, on the basis of the law of private property. And that, I repeat, is the law of enrichment through the ever-increasing productivity of labor. So the freedom of private property, therefore, I quote again, necessarily requires the establishment of civil government to prevent bloodshed and disorder and to contain the indignance, quote, of the many. So Smith charges the state with, in a word, resolving the class struggle on a liberal basis. And he talks about this particularly in chapter 8 of the Wealth of Nations. There he introduces the class struggle. He says the interests of the masters and the interests of the workers are not the same. They are in fact opposed to each other. They are antagonistic, he argues. For the master wants to give as little as possible, which is understandable, because they are driven by self-interest. They don't want to give much, they want to get much. They want to get the ever-increasing labor productivity from their laborers. And he says, on the other hand, are the workers. They want to get as much as possible. They cannot satisfy their wants. They are driven by want. And they want to get as much as possible. He says, their situation, I quote, is desperate. And because the situation is desperate, they are apt to rise up and to strike and to engage in insurrection and riots. In other words, into bloodshed and disorder. But, he says, very seldom will they get any benefit from that. And they will not get many benefit from that because the masters, he says, quote, are far and few in numbers. And they combine, he said, or they can combine very easily and starve the workers back to work. The workers have no independent means of subsistence. Their only means of subsistence is through their labor, through wage-based employment. And the masters can combine easily means that the masters shut their factories. And there is the breakdown of working class solidarity. When nobody gets a wage, nobody can be charitable. And they're starved, he says, back to work. Instead, he argues, a free man, in other words, not a slave, a free man, is much cheaper than a slave. Because your slave is your property. When you don't need his or her work, you still need to feed them. But the workers, he says, they are free. They are self-responsible. You are not responsible for them. They don't belong to you. They are free. And the poor, he says, are regulated by death. So how in his view then, what needs to happen to resolve this, what he calls a desperate situation, desperate conditions, social conflict, struggle, disorder, insurrection? How to resolve that? And Smith tries to resolve it by arguing ostensibly for the workers and against the masters. In chapter 8 and 9, he says, the masters, they are just interested for themselves. They ask for protectionism. They monopolize prices to guarantee their income artificially. Thereby, he says, the masters do not develop the free economy. Thereby, the masters do not develop or are not engaged in increasing labor productivity. And by not increasing labor productivity, they do not create, or the economy does not create, a liberal reward for labor through the ever-increasing demand for labor. He says the liberal reward of labor is in fact dependent on unimpeded market regulations and market relations that force the masters to increase labor productivity, thereby social wealth increases, thereby the slice that goes to the poor increases, and thereby, he says, a workman, a free man, a free laborer, and I quote, will become richer than African kings. So the state has to make sure that the dynamic, that the logic of wealth dynamic based on ever-increasing labor productivity materializes. The state, therefore, is required to govern for the free economy, to govern for unimpeded market relations, to govern against protectionism, to govern for the ever-increasing productivity of labor, in order, as it were, resolve the desperate situation of the poor, he says cynically. So, he argues, on the one hand, civil government, I quote, so far as it instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have no property at all. Yet, the defense of private property for Smith, the defense of private property against the indignation of the poor, is undertaken in the interest of the poor as the only means of the system of perfect liberty, in order for the poor to benefit from the increase of their for the increase in their productivity of labor, to secure and safeguard the trickle-down of wealth to the poor. So he says, I quote again, whatever regulations are made with respect to trade, commerce, agriculture, and manufactures of the country are considered as belonging to the police. And police here does not mean policeman or policewoman. Police here means public policy. Whatever regulations are made, every aspect of trade, commerce, manufacture, whatever it is, are considered as belonging to public policy. The objective of public policy, he says, is the achievement of an ever greater, I quote, cheapness of provision through the increase in the productivity of labor. You cannot leave this to the masters, who will cut throat, who will monopolize prices, who will divide up markets. The state is required to facilitate that, both in the will of the masters, in terms of their entrepreneurial will, in the law of the country, and by going against all kinds of protectionisms and monopoly pricing, to facilitate the unimpeded economy, unimpeded economic relations, unimpeded market forces, so that the invisible hand can be expected to do its work, which is the work of forcing through price signals each master to constantly adapt to the limits of the market by increased labor productivity. So the increase in labor productivity, he says, facilitates or produces, quote, what we call police, or what we call public policy. And I suppose it's no longer so obscure that Adam Smith, in fact, defines political economy not as a science of the free economy, not as a science of the invisible hand, but as a science of the branch of the statesman and legislator. A science of law, a science of order, and a science of facilitation, the facilitation of competitive adjustment to markets, to price signals, on the basis of an ever-increasing labor economy. In fact, he says, to the princes to whom he talks, in this commercial society, you, the state, have no independent income. Your income depends on tax revenue. And tax revenue is the function of a flourishing economy. Furthermore, he argues, in favor of world market pressure, and he says, World market pressure keeps the liberal state honest as a liberal state, as a liberalizing state, as a state that sets the framework conditions within which the invisible hand can be expected to do its work. So he says, I quote, "The proprietor of stock is properly a citizen of the world and is not attached to any particular country. He says he would be apt to abandon the country in which he was exposed to a vexatious inquisition in order to be assessed to a burdensome tax and would remove his stock to some other country where he could carry on his business or enjoy his fortune more at his ease." So the state cannot overtax, cannot ask too many questions, because the tax base upon which the state's wealth depends might migrate to a different country. And that, he says, will keep the liberal state honest as a facilitator of the dynamic of social wealth, which is a dynamic of ever-increasing labor productivity. Furthermore, he argues that the owners of stock in some other country might achieve higher rates of return on their investment than owners in our country, which no doubt, he says, demonstrates the redundancy of their stock, because they cannot compete. But not being able to compete also means that there is clamor, that there is a demand for protectionist measures to maintain their capital investment. Thus there is a demand, or there is a force to corrupt government, to protect their interests. But he says, this will only exacerbate their losses. It will exacerbate their loss of competitiveness and impoverish the state and its people relative to other countries. In order, he says, for their stock to be maintained, competition or competitive adjustment at home is required. Its achievement is a matter of market police. Now, I use the word market police here. Smith doesn't use the word. Smith just talks about police. But market police is the term, in fact, used by neoliberals, particularly German neoliberals, but also Milton Friedman, to determine and define the purposes of the liberal state. They define the purpose of the liberal state as market police. And effective policing entails a strong state, a state that does not let itself be corrupted by powerful economic interests. Effective policing entails an independent state that governs according to the law of private property against the egoistic interests and against the class interests. Ostensibly, not governing in the interest of either, but in the interest of the beauty of the well-ordered whole, securing its propriety as a system of private property that increases the wealth of nations through competitive adjustments to price movements on the basis of greater labor productivity. One could argue that what Smith here argues, or conceives, is a capitalist state that invariably behaves as a planner for the global competitiveness of its natural labor force. And the idea of the state as a planner for competition is, in fact, or I quoted here, from Friedrich Hayek, from the Road of Serfdom, where he says the existence of a state invariably means state intervention. The state cannot not intervene. The question is the method and objective? Is it planning for central purposes, or is it planning for competition? Hayek conceives of the state as a planner for competition. So when Marx, coming back to Marx, then argues that the state is the executive, or that the modern executive of the state is a committee for managing the common affairs of the entire bourgeoisie, not of specific interest, but of the entire bourgeoisie. The law of private property, the enforcement of the law of private property, which is the enforcement of ever-increasing labor productivity, or so Marx calls valorization of value, money-making, making money out of money. And that the state, he argues, in Capital, is the organized power and concentrated force of bourgeois society. I think that should be clearer now why Marx comes to these critical terms: executive committee, concentrated force, organized power of bourgeois society. So that brings my part about Adam Smith to an end. I'm now going to talk a little bit about Marxist state theory. And of course, there are many variations in approach, in interpretation, in conceptualization. Nevertheless, one could say they resolve around three distinct and contradictory approaches: Leninism, social democracy, and what I call political form analysis. Leninism sees the state as the direct instrument of class oppression. One class oppresses the other class by means of state. So the state here is a state in capitalist society. It is the organized force of the ruling class. One needs to get hold of it, needs to seize it in order to change things around. And Leninism is supported, as it were, by Marx and Engels, again from the Communist Manifesto, where they say that the state is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another class. So Leninism then is the theory of the state as the executive committee of the ruling class, and it argues that the conduct of government reflects the interests of the dominant class or capitalist fraction. I think Leninism overplays the non-independence of the state. As we already heard when I talked about Adam Smith, the liberal state meets its objective as a consequence of its independence from the masters, not as a direct power of this or that master. So I suppose Leninism, in my critique, overemphasizes the state as the direct power of a particular class fraction. And for Marx also, the capitalist for Marx is not in control of his or her destiny. Marx conceives of the capitalist as a personification of capital, as an agent of a process that manifests itself behind their backs. But the capitalist state even remains a capitalist state when the capitalists are not in charge, when representatives of the labor movement, social democracy, run it. So the capitalist state does not seem to be a capitalist state because it is governed directly by the capitalists, who have other business to attend to. Clearly, the working class is the object of the capitalist state. Object insofar as the wealth of nations depends on the ever-increasing productivity of their labor. But how is it possible when the capitalists themselves are not in charge? At its emergence, Leninist state theory was opposed by social democracy. Social democracy fundamentally saw the state as independent and neutral, as an independent and neutral area for struggle over the implementation of transformative social reforms. The perennial question about the social democratic conception is whether the economy has autonomy vis-à-vis the national state, or conversely, whether the national state has autonomy vis-à-vis the economy. Crudely put, in the social democratic argument, I quote here from Fritz Haug, the power of money and capital retreat when the state advances. So the state, when the power of money retreats and the state advances, it creates conditions for government to act in the interests of the workers. In this perspective, the conduct of government and the dynamic of the economy expresses the balance of power between the social forces that act through the national state. Yet, can the democratic state govern against the economy? Can that really be done? Social democracy proposes always, and rightly so, a policy of full employment. It proposes a policy of welfare protection. How can that be done when social democracy governs against the interests of the capitalist economy? The livelihood of workers depends on economic growth, depends on the competitiveness of the economy, depends on its profitability. Bankrupt employers don't employ. They shed labor. An economy which doesn't grow does not provide the tax income required to pay for welfare state security. For workers to be employed and receive wages that connects them with the means of life, the economy has to be competitive. The redistribution of wealth from capital to labor depends upon the profitability of the expended labor. The premise of social democracy is the achievement of economic growth, or put Marxistically, it depends on the rate of capitalist accumulation, which is the conversion of extracted surplus value into new forms of economic activity. So social democracy depends on the extraction of surplus value on the part of those whose full employment it seeks to support. That is, in politics for the benefit of workers, inevitably becomes a continuation and confirmation of the economy. And the state becomes a concentrated form, therefore, of economic compulsion. Rather than being a potential means of emancipation from this compulsion, the conceptuality of the political system requires the class tied to work for profit in order for an economy to be taxable in support of welfare state safety nets. So I argue, therefore, in either case, Leninism or social democracy, the state really has been conceived of as a state in capitalist society, but not as a state of capitalist society. And throughout its institutions, it is stamped, as it were, its procedures and ideologies, with the contradictions of the capitalist social relations, or with the antinomies of the labor movement that demands full employment and welfare protection, and thereby acknowledges the necessity of increased labor productivity to maintain the global competitiveness of the economy. The political form approach is different from these two. It developed, as I said earlier, in the context of the New Left of '68, particularly during the 1970s, in the former West Germany and also in the UK. It developed a critique of the state fetishism of both social democracy and Leninism. It argued with Marx, and now I've got a couple of Marx quotations in support of the form approach. It argues with Marx, and now I'm quoting from the critique of the Gotha program, that the state does not possess its own intellectual and libertarian basis. In other words, the rationality of the state is the rationality of the social relations to which it belongs. It has no independent rationality, no independent libertarian base. The form approach conceives of the capitalist state as the political form of the capitalist social relations, and this conception is also, or can also call upon Marx, as I already quoted from the German ideology at the start of my talk. The state, he says in the German ideology, is the form in which the individuals of which society consists have subsequently given themselves a collective expression. Or later in Capital, he says that the state, I quote, is the concentrated and organized force of society. In an earlier preparatory text in the Grundrisse, he refers to the state as the political form of society viewed in relationship to itself. Or the state is the form of society viewed in relationship to itself. The logic of this argument is that society doubles itself up into society and state. That is, I quote, the state is society's independent power. Therefore, what appears in the distinction between state and economy is in fact a false separation. Separation is real and false at the same time. It belongs, the separation, to the political economy of capitalist society or to the political economy of bourgeois society. As the collective expression of bourgeois society, the state is neither a property of a class nor a neutral or independent power. Rather, like the commodity form, it is a form of historically definite social relations. While the commodity form is the economic form of capitalist society, the state is its political form. In its economic form, capitalist society manifests itself as a depoliticized exchange society, in which formally equal subjects of law are at liberty to pursue their rational interests by making contracts with each other as property owners, be that as owners of labor power or as owners of the means of production. Who depoliticizes society? Which institution is charged with concentrating the political, which therefore is charged with absorbing the political, which therefore is charged that by absorbing the political character of bourgeois society, depoliticizes the conduct in bourgeois society? Which institution provides an order of contract? Which institution provides for the law of contract? Which institution enforces the contract? Which institution recognizes rich and poor as equals before the law? And that institution, the institution of depoliticization, the institution of order, the institution of law, and the institution of legalizing the social relations, is the independent power of the state. So the political character of capitalist society manifests itself as a concentrated power of social order and the rule of law, of order and law. The state concentrates the political power of bourgeois society, and by doing so successfully depoliticizes the social relations as relations of private property, as relations of exchange, as relations of liberty, and as relations of the freedom of contract between equals before the law. So regardless then of their inequality in property, the traders in labor power appear as equal legal subjects of contract. The rule of law does not discriminate or privilege the rich over the poor in the ideal world, the best possible world. It thereby forbids, as it were, the dispossessed sellers of labor power and the owners of great wealth equally from stealing bread. Or the law, in its abstract majesty, forbids rich and poor equally to sleep under bridges. And that's my talk for the day. Tomorrow we come back to the topics I raised by looking at the legal form or the rule of law as the law of private property, as the law of contract. Well, thank you.
Thank you.